Okay, well, we've hit the top of the hour, and I see we have some people joining us. So I think we can get the introduction piece started, just out of respect for the folks who have joined us. So welcome to this live webinar on Teams First in Architecture, Information Architecture and Governance with Peter Carson. My name's Julian Mills. I'm a vice president with the company, and it's my pleasure today to both introduce Peter, but very much looking forward to facilitating a lot of questions. This is a very dynamic session, and the more input Peter gets, the more lively it'll be. So this is obviously a meeting about Teams, so we're running it on Teams, just for brand consistency there. I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with the platform, so do remember that it's a regular Teams meeting, and chat's going to be open throughout the webinar. And I'll say it again, we're really interested in hearing your questions and comments. So please do stay on mute, but do add questions or comments to the chat, and we'll be watching out for those and jumping in to forward them to Peter during the call. So before we jump in on the topic, we'll just talk a little bit about you and the folks on the call. We had really strong registration for this event, and you can see a very strong North American concentration, but it's also really great to see people joining us from other continents as well. Many of you on the call know Peter and understand that he's a 13-time Microsoft MVP. And he does travel extensively. I think he's going to be sharing his itinerary with us, but he is joining us from New Zealand, where he is getting ready to present this workshop at the Digital Workplace Conference. And you know from Peter's LinkedIn profile, I hope that he's very active when he does go abroad. So Peter, without further ado, I can hand things over to you.
Thanks, Julian, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm actually, as Julian mentioned, in New Zealand, so it's February 14th. If you're in North America or Europe, happy Valentine's Day from the future. It's February 15th here, which is always weird, but we'll keep that sorted from that point of view. So before we jump in, I thought it would be good to define information architecture as a term. I mean, that's the topic for today's session. And oddly enough, I didn't have this slide in this deck. I've done this presentation a number of times. It was actually one of the more popular ones at Digital Workplace Conference last year in New Zealand, which was my first time in New Zealand. Lovely country. And I actually put it to Copilot. So I was starting to play with Copilot in Word, Excel, PowerPoint. I said, hey, Copilot, give me a slide that explains what information architecture is in Microsoft 365. And this is what it came up with. And I've got a couple other slides I use Copilot for. And I tweaked those ones. This one, I was actually pretty happy with it as it came out of the box. And the first point is really key. You know, the whole idea of a good information architecture is to organize your content in a way that's easy to find and use. If you've ever been subject to somebody else's file share, file folder organization, you know, maybe you've joined a company and they've had a file server for 20 years and somebody's built, you know, a nested library of 20 folders deep that makes perfect sense to that person's brain. The next person comes in and says, I don't know how to find anything. Like, this just doesn't make any sense. And that's what information architecture is about, is getting that organization structure there. It's not about just organizing what you have. It's building a structure that takes you forward into the future and makes sense for everybody in your organization. And it's about aligning your business needs and objectives, understanding what do you do as a business, what type of work do you do, and how do you best organize that. A consistent user experience is super important to this as well. We'll talk later about you know, third-party products that help in the Teams governance space, and a big part of that is templates and this idea that, you know, if we're going to be creating Teams and SharePoint sites in Microsoft 365, if we do those in a consistent way, then people will understand how to find things. If you're looking, you know, projects is a common scenario that we see with a lot of organizations. Most organizations do projects. Well, if every project has a unique structure to it and a unique set of folders and way that you organize it, it's going to be very confusing as you go from project A to B to C. So we can do that in a consistent way. That's super ideal. And at the end of the day, it's about facilitating collaboration and communication. This idea of information architecture, you know, goes back a long time. We used to talk about this a lot in the SharePoint space, and we build a SharePoint IA, we would call it, of the structure, and that was really around the document collaboration. Teams kind of adds another level to that to say, hey, properly structured Teams, a Microsoft team, the place that you go with the individual team itself, I know the name is confusing, is the place that you both communicate and collaborate. It's a place where your files are and where your conversations are, and you bring those together. And that's a strong part of building the IA out. But let's take a step back in time and start on the SharePoint side just for a second here. So, SharePoint Online, I've been using this mantra for more than 20 years. I've been working with SharePoint since the beginning back in 2001. This idea of a single version of the truth. If you think about historically, a lot of people use their email and their inbox as a document management tool, and they attach documents to emails and send them around to people. It's always been a horrible way of working. I've hated it for a very long time. And this concept that you can have a single place where that document lives and you share links to it, even in an email world, makes a ton of sense. And the SharePoint Online becomes your document and records repository for the organization. It's the place where you collaborate for a document sharing point of view. It can also be your corporate intranet. It can be your publishing of news and events and such out to the organization. It is the foundation underneath Teams. And we'll talk more about this, that when you create a team, that files tab that you see in Teams is a SharePoint site itself. And obviously forms and workflows, and there's a lot of other stuff that you can do within SharePoint itself. Now, back in the day, we used to build SharePoint sites and subsites and sort of nested structure from that point of view. When Modern came out, which is about 5-6 years ago, I guess now, is when Microsoft kind of revamped and brought out their Modern SharePoint. They said, hey, let's flatten this. Let's get rid of subsites. All sites are flat in structure. But then they brought out this hub site model to allow you to provide some organization and connect related hubs together. And you can nest, multiple levels of hubs and such. So this all does come into the information architecture planning. Of course, everybody loves folders. We've still got folders. You can create folders underneath channels inside of libraries in SharePoint. You can create document sets, which I'm keen on. Think of them as a folder with metadata. So you've got a folder that you want to tag certain information about. Document sets work really well for that. Unfortunately, they haven't gotten a ton of love from Microsoft. They haven't really got a modern look to them. There's an active MVP thread going with Microsoft about this topic, but that lays into what you're going to be doing from an information architecture point of view as well. But let's leave the documents and SharePoint side and come over to the Teams and the conversation side. If I was in a room with you, I would say, everybody put up your hand if you love the organization of your inbox, and I'd be shocked if anybody actually put their hand up, because inboxes become unmanageable. This was another Copilot slide, and the second bullet in there said hundreds or thousands of emails can pile up. And I changed it to hundreds of thousands because I looked at my inbox and I've got more than 250,000 emails in there, and I purged my mailbox a year or two ago. Like, it's completely overwhelming. It's this black box that's just out of control. I have an assistant from an inbox point of view. Her name's Amanda. She's on the call. Actually, she's freaking awesome. And her job is to try and sort through my inbox and organize that. AI, I'm assuming, will get better at that and make that better. But at the end of the day, email has kind of gone away as primary mode of communication for me. And for Envision IT as an organization, we've wholesale switched to Teams. And that actually happened before COVID. We got into Teams in 2017 when it first came out. We started with our marketing group, and it quickly grew through the organization. And just as any organization that adopted Teams through COVID, it kind of explodes and gets out of control, and then you try and pull that back again from there. So, try and avoid email as much as you can, particularly from an internal communication point of view. I know it's a change, and change management is a big part of, you build this wonderful new information architecture. How do you get people to actually adopt and embrace it? Is get champions, get people understanding the advantages of it from that point of view. But then we switch over to Teams, and Teams, one of the first things people do is, hey, I can do one-on-one chats. Julie and I, let's get a chat going, and then let's add Irene into that chat. Now we've got a group chat going, and that's awesome. And that works really well. We're going to talk about channel conversations versus group chat, and why group chat gets overused by a lot of organizations and just becomes confusing. This was another ChatGPT one. It's just a sample conversation of what does a confusing group chat look like? They start talking about a budget report. Yeah, we're on track for this quarter. And then Mike's like, hey, has anybody seen my coffee mug? And it just gets confusing from there. And then Samantha near the end says, hey, can you please keep the chat on topic? Thing is, Mike was actually the right guy in this conversation, because group chat is the place to ask, hey, where is my coffee mug? It's not the place to say, hey, what's going on with the budget report, and are we tracking well from a sales? That's the channel conversation. That's something that you want to come back to. Next week, maybe Mike loses his coffee mug all the time, but you don't really need to come back to that conversation. So if you think about it, is it in the moment right now? Hey, are we going to break for lunch? Or are we going to power through and get this done? That's a chat. Hey, what's happening with our budgets and our financial reports and such? That's a channel conversation. It has history to it. You want to capture it from that point of view. So that kind of takes me to the next slide here, which is how Teams and SharePoint layer together, and these different concepts of chat versus channel conversations, how they come together as part of that as well. So like I said, chat is where most people started in Teams, and when I look at our Microsoft 365 usage reports, one of the graphs it has is how much chat you have versus channel conversations. And I think we're a really strong channel conversation organization. Chat is still 10-1 against it. And part of that is because we have meetings like this, and you'll get 100, 200 chats going on in the meeting. So you do get a lot of chat activity that makes sense. But there's still times where, hey, don't get a group conversation going on that. Let's get that over into a channel conversation. But if you are doing chats, the way to think about it is everything you do in a chat here on the left is kind of related to your OneDrive for Business. And there's a similar argument around OneDrive for Business versus team sites in SharePoint. When should I use my personal OneDrive? When should I use my team sites? And it's gotten a little more confusing. There was another very active thread on the MVP and Microsoft Engineering. There's an NDA team that I belong to as part of that, around this topic, that, hey, Microsoft is really pushing the OneDrive side, and it's causing confusion, that people are thinking they should be doing things in OneDrive, and really we want to encourage people to do things in team sites. And the same kind of argument applies, that if it's something that you're doing just for yourself, and you're not going to be sharing it, or you don't want to share it with other people just yet, it's quick, it's not long-lived, OneDrive for Business makes sense from that point of view. But if you start inviting in a dozen people to your project folder inside of your OneDrive for Business, you got to pause and say, hey, should I actually make that a team site or a team over in Teams and manage it there? And the answer is yes. As you start to bring people in, yes, you can do sharing in OneDrive for Business. For the most part, you want to be moving that over to team sites. But if you are doing chats and you say, hey, I want to attach a file and send it to you as part of the chat that we're having, that file that you've attached is going to end up in your OneDrive for Business, and it's going to be shared with that person that you were chatting with. Again, just kind of like the email conversation that I had earlier, for the most part, you want to try and avoid that. If that's the financial report, don't have a copy of it in your OneDrive and share that through a chat with somebody else. Now you've got multiple copies of the same Excel going on. Figure out where it lives in ideally the finance team, and just copy a link to that, and then share that in your chat. And even though you're having a one-on-one chat, it can still point back to something that's in a team site or a Microsoft team from there. So it's making sure people understand these nuances and where to work and how to work. So, predominantly you're going to want to drive a lot of your collaboration into the middle part here, which is the channel conversations. So we've got teams. You can create as many teams as you want in your organization, and each team can have up to 1,000 channels underneath that. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, is how do we build that structure? When I create channels for people to have conversations in, there is a team site underneath that. There actually need to be multiple team sites. We'll get to that point in a minute, which is where the document collaboration should happen on. The place that you work on the documents should be the place where you talk about those documents. That's the way I kind of think about it. So the channel within a team is the place where you talk about those documents, and the files tab underneath that is where you have the work. If you keep that mantra together and say, hey, this makes sense, you'd likely have a good information architecture. Now on the far right, we've got communication sites. So there's still a need for standalone SharePoint sites, your company intranet. You've got, learning sites, learning pathways, things like that. Those can live as standalone communication sites that are not connected to Teams at all. So this next slide's, a little small to read. Apologies on that. It's kind of showing you the underlying architecture of a Microsoft team. So on the left here, we've got our Microsoft team, and it has what's called a Microsoft 365 group underneath it. A Microsoft 365 group has a shared mailbox. It has a group entry and enter ID, which is the new name for Azure Active Directory. It has a SharePoint site collection for all of its documents to live in. It also has a OneNote. So when you're keeping notes, it needs to be a wiki concept in Teams. Thankfully, they've gotten rid of it, and they've gone full on OneNote, which I love, and that becomes part of your team as well. And then depending on what type of channels you create, if you create what are called private and shared channels, and I'll explain those in a minute, they actually create their own site collections as well. So you can get this fairly complex structure in Microsoft 365 as part of one team. So it helps as you're planning out your information architecture to understand what that underlying architecture looks like, because it's going to get created as you're creating your teams. Make sure you understand the implications of that. So let's explain this types of Teams channels concept. So in the beginning, there was just standard channels, and a standard channel is open to all team members. So I create a team. I always get a general channel. That general channel is always a standard channel, and everybody that belongs to the team belongs to that channel. I can create, 999 more standard channels, and everybody that's in that team has access to all 1,000 of those standard channels, if that's what I've chosen to do. And what happens under the hood, there's a single SharePoint site collection that's created as part of the original team, and you'll see when you go into the documents for it, a general folder, and that corresponds to the general channel in Teams. And as I create more standard channels, it'll just create more folders within that documents library in SharePoint. And then Microsoft brought out private channels. Private channels were the idea that, hey, I want to create a channel, but I don't want everybody in my team to have access to it. I want a subset of those people to begin that channel, which seemed like a good idea. So private channels are only visible to the channel members. And what Microsoft did was, when you create a private channel, instead of just creating a folder, it creates a separate site collection. And private channels, I think, are 4 or 5 years old. They were fairly early in the Teams evolution at Microsoft. And I was kind of annoyed at Microsoft. I thought, why did you change the structure? Why didn't you just create new folders for the private channel? Just change the permissions on it so that the people that are in the private channel can see that folder and everything stays in that one SharePoint site and it's nice and clean. It's funny, I've actually switched my mindset the other way, where I kind of wish that every channel, regardless of whether it's the standard, private, or shared channel, has its own site collection for it. And it kind of goes way back. If you remember Dan Holm, he's the product manager for Viva Engage now. When I first got to know him 10, 12 years ago, he was actually an MVP. He was not a Microsoft employee. And he was always beating everybody up to say, you shouldn't create subsites. Every SharePoint site should be its own site collection, and it's not too big of a unit of work. And I got that by the time we got to modern and kind of bought in on it. And I kind of feel this way here as well, that it would be nice that each channel would have its own unique SharePoint site as part of it. And then about 18 months ago, Microsoft brought out the concept of a shared channel. And shared channel, like private channel, is visible only to the channel members. The difference between private and shared is that shared can bring in members from outside of the containing team, whereas private can only be a subset of the team. But otherwise, it's the same. It creates a new site collection in that scenario as well. So I don't know if everybody remembers Venn diagrams from back in high school. It's been a few years for me, but I kind of like the concept here that, hey, we've got our main team here on the right. And if we want to create a private channel, its membership can only draw from the team that it lives in. You can make the private channel be the entire members of the team. There wouldn't be much point to that. You might as well just create a standard channel at that point. But the beauty of the shared channel is the shared channel can draw people from the team. In fact, you can make a team a member of a shared channel, and everybody who's in the team is in that shared channel. And you can actually bring in other teams and say, make the entire membership of this other team a member of this shared channel as well. So if you've got say a cross-functional project that's involving 3 or 4 different departments in your organization, maybe they each have their own department teams, which is a very common scenario we'll talk about in information architecture planning, but you want a place where those 4 departments can all work together. You create a shared channel, you put all 4 teams as members of those shared channel. You don't need to manage the individual people then. Anybody that belongs to any of those 4 teams belongs to that shared channel. So it's a beautiful way of doing it from that point of view. A lot of people think of shared channels as a place to bring external users in, and that is a very important part of it. But it can be purely internal as well. It doesn't have to be from an external point of view. Now, when you bring external users in, I'll talk about this in a second, the way they come in is a little bit different. And I think it's much better from an external user perspective. But there's some caveats and things to be aware of from that perspective. So when we're talking about IA, I just saw Larry's chat there. It can be a little complex for external users. Actually, Irina, do you want to grab the shared channels article and just chat it out to the group? Because I think that's an important thing that we don't have in here that we should. It is complex, and that's one of the challenges around that. But when we're talking about bringing external people into your Microsoft 365, which absolutely should be part of your information architecture planning, what parts of our Microsoft 365 IA are just for our internal staff, and how do we want to share with external? Some organizations say, we're not going to share anything. Everything needs to be locked down and private to us. The reality is you're always going to share with externals. It just may not happen through Microsoft 365 in that scenario. And I would argue that it's more secure and better than email sharing or setting up shadow IT, Dropbox, things like that, that you should embrace it and should figure out a strategy for it in your Microsoft 365. And there's this concept called B2B guests, which is I can invite somebody from another organization, or they could just be an individual. They could have a Microsoft account. They don't have to. They use something called a one-time passcode to sign in. It just emails them a passcode each time they go to sign in. So getting those external people in is actually very easy in the B2B guest scenario. Microsoft's done a really good job on that side from that point of view. And from a document sharing point of view, it works beautifully. I can share a document, a folder, a library, an entire SharePoint site, and that person can access and collaborate depending on what rights I've given them through there. If I invite that B2B guest into a team, which I can do, the challenge is they need to switch their tenant. And this is where it gets confusing for the external people. So if I bring up my teams here for a second, I've got lots of teams through here. This is an example of an external one that I've got some other folks from outside the organization in. And for those people to be able to see this team, they actually have to come up in the top here and switch into one of the, in my case, many other tenants that they belong to. Like this Microsoft tenant here is an important one for me because that's where all the MVP conversations are. But yes, Microsoft's done some changes recently to the new Teams. If you're using the new Teams experience, that I at least get desktop pop-up toasts when somebody mentions me on one of those other teams, so I'm aware of it. But if I'm not sitting in front of my computer paying attention to that in that moment in time, it's lost and I don't see it. The only way I see the activity feed and what's happening in that other tenant is actually to switch to it, and I lose visibility to Envision IT, do what I need to do there, and then switch back. You can get fancy and get browser profiles going and have multiple copies of Teams running, which I've done for client projects where we've been heavily involved in their teams. It's not ideal, and it's not what your average user is going to want to do. So that's sort of the downside to the B2B guest scenario in Teams. Works great for document collaboration, still not awesome from a Teams conversation point of view. B2B Direct Connect is directly related to shared channels. When I invite an organization in through a shared channel, they see that team just within all their other teams that belong to their organization. The activity feed shows what's happening in there. It works really well. In fact, if I come over to our teams here, we've got our project teams, our internal department level teams. One of the important ones for us is the COM partners team. And you can see this little icon here that indicates that it's a shared channel. What we do is set up shared channels for each of our partners. Flock Consulting is one of our New Zealand partners that we're doing a lot of work with. I was in this quite a bit recently. Katie Double is a Power BI person at Flock that's helping me on a report for this presentation that I'm going to show you. And we were chatting late last night and early this morning with Archer, and Katie sees that in her Flock team. She doesn't need to switch to an Envision IT one. So it works really well from that point of view. The challenge is we needed Flock to do some stuff in order to be able to invite them into our shared channel. We have to do that with each organization that we're going to work with. And some orgs, are not up to speed on shared channel, or maybe they have security concerns around there, which in my opinion are unfounded, but nevertheless, you'll have some orgs that say, hey, we're just not going to set this up with you. And you're stuck from that point of view. Where this gets really messy is once you've created a shared channel, or actually a private channel this applies to as well, you can no longer do any document sharing from that SharePoint site that gets created for it to B2B guests. So we actually hit this yesterday with Flock. In addition to helping us on work, we've got project work going on with them. We were doing a big RFP that was due at 11 o'clock yesterday, and Flock had brought it in an external contractor, awesome project manager who was going to work on the project. He's like, can you share these RFP documents so I can have a look at things? He's not part of Flock. It's not part of the shared channel. We couldn't B2B invite him in. The only thing we could do was email attach and send him the files, which we decided, hey, it was 2 hours before closing time. It's not worth it at this point. But there are challenges around sharing and the whole shared channels, standard channels, B2B guests, B2B direct. It is a confusing topic. It's something I'm bringing up with Microsoft. I'm going to be out in Redmond for MVP Summit in a couple of weeks' time. I definitely want to have deeper conversations with the engineering team about it from that point of view. And I'm not alone. There was an active MVP thread that I started on this topic that we're still working through from there. So I know I went deep into the channels, but it's a really important part of the Teams IA topic. So just to recap from a shared channel point of view, they're great for both internal and externally shared channels, but you can't share files from that shared channel with anyone who's not in the channel. That's a really important point to remember. So do you like the convenience of external users not having to tenant switch in Teams? If they're using Teams a lot, they're good with shared channels, it's an awesome experience. But will 100% of the people that you want to bring in be able to set up B2B to connect, or is their org going to block it? That's something you got to be aware of as well. And I've had MVPs say to me just recently, if we can't get 100% of the people to use this, then we don't want to use it at all. And I get that. It'd be nice to have a standardized way of doing that. Okay. So this comes to probably our biggest point for the webinar. We're about the halfway mark through it. The question that each of you needs to answer yourselves as part of a group think within your organization is, what does a team and what does a channel represent in my organization? Because this is key to the Teams IA. Everything falls out from there. Your whole SharePoint structure, underneath that, of the types of channels you're going to be creating and the structure for that comes out of those two questions. What does a team and what does a channel represent in my organization? Now, there's some obvious ones. Every organization, for-profit, not-for-profit, public sector, what have you, typically has departments. Unless you're a company of one and you still have departments, you just, one person runs all the departments. That's an obvious case where, hey, we have teams for departments. Maybe we have channels for sub-departments, depending on how big they are through there. Or maybe those sub-departments need their own teams. Again, what scale of organization are you talking about is going to drive some of those decisions. But then it gets into the secret sauce of what does your organization actually do? If I think about Envision IT, we're historically a consulting company. We've transitioned to become a SaaS product company, but we still have a strong consulting side to our business. What do consultants do? They do projects for clients, and that's a very common scenario, not just in tech consulting. So having that concept of a team for every client, and maybe you have channels for projects, or maybe your projects are so big that they should have their own team to it, whether it's an internal project that you're doing as a company or as an organization, or whether you're a consulting or a delivery organization and that project is for one of your clients. You could have channels for phases within that. You could have geographic locations and projects underneath that. Every organization is going to be a little bit different, and it's not necessarily a one size fits all even within one organization. You can have from very small projects to very large projects. We worked with the PMO, the Project Management Office at City of Vaughan, building out an IA for them. And they were like, well, we have these massive capital projects, literally multi-billion-dollar, multi-year infrastructure build. We're building a new hospital, we're building a new highway, whatever the case may be. Those are big, big projects. They should probably have their own team as part of them. They're going to have phases. There's going to have lots of external parties come into them. They need their own structure in there versus, a department level project. Hey, we want to upgrade one of our IT systems next quarter, and let's do a project for that. Does that need its own team? Maybe yes, but maybe it's just a channel. Maybe it's just a folder within a channel. Again, like I say, there's no one size fits all from that perspective. If I think back to what I briefly showed you in our Teams IA, and full disclosure, ours was created 6-7 years ago now. It's kind of morphed, and we've been doing a lot of navel gazing recently to say, hey, does this structure still make sense for us going forward? We made a decision back in the day that we were going to create teams for every client, because historically, before we had teams, we created a SharePoint site collection for each client, and that worked really well. We had a place for all the documents for the work that we're doing for the client. We could create folders for projects. We could bring clients in. We like to work very transparently, so we would share with them and they could see all that. It just kind of transitioned nicely into the teams and channels side. The challenge I face now is we've got hundreds of teams. We're a company of 24 people. It's a little bit overwhelming. As I start scrolling down through my teams on the left here, there's a lot here, and then I get into my hidden teams, and there's a whole lot more. So, and one of the things I don't like about teams, there's no nice organization of the teams themselves. You can't group them, pull them together from a nav point of view. It becomes very confusing. I mean, there is a filter here where you can type in a name of a team or a channel to find it, but I find it a little awkward. It'd be nice if we could better organize. Even if I could just say, take all of these teams and alphabetically sort them rather than having to drag them up and down myself to do that manually, which is an onerous process. But you can see we've got teams for departments. Like we have development. We're a technical organization. That development team is a very active one for us. We have consultants, so there's a consulting team. We have our partners that I showed you. We have an HR team, an infrastructure, and management, and marketing. So your typical teams that represent departments that you would see in a lot of organizations. That's a very common pattern from there. But then within an individual client team, like this is a pro bono project we use for example purposes, we decided, hey, let's create channels for each project, and that'll keep things organized from there. Where it started to fall off the rails, in my opinion, is we started creating channels for phases of the same project as well. And then it got confusing because you were talking about something from the previous phase at the same time you're talking about the new phase and which channel was it in, and I had to go find things. I said, hey, what if we said, let's just keep one general channel for every client, and that's it. We'll have folders for projects from a documents point of view, but we have one place to go for the conversations point of view. We haven't gone there just yet. And then I started thinking, well, this, in partners with shared channels is working awesome for partners. What if we had one team for all of our clients, and we had a shared channel underneath that for each individual client? It becomes really nice because channels you can pin. So I can pin, my main clients that I work a lot with up to the top. I can hide the ones that I don't care with. The rest get nicely alphabetically sorted for me. The only challenge is that issue that we'd like to invite clients in. They can't always use shared channels. We're kind of dead in the water from that point of view. So we're at a crossroads where we say, hey, we know what we'd like to do. Teams doesn't quite let us do that. So how do we go ahead and do that? I just saw a comment there about Planner inside of private channels. I'd be curious to dig into that one as well, because as you create teams and channels, it's not just documents and files. You can have things like your OneNote, but you can add other elements like Planner is an obvious one for doing task management in as part of that. And that could even become part of your template as you're building that out. So it's still a work in progress, and that's probably true of any organization. I mean, you don't build your IA and you never touch it again. It's something you think about and revise and adjust as you go forward through there. So how do you begin? What does it look like to start implementing what we call a Teams first information architecture? We actually talked about this topic pre-COVID, and we would say, hey, you're not in Teams yet, but you should think about planning your SharePoint IA to support Teams. I think pretty much everybody who's in 365 is in Teams now, so that point is moot from that perspective. And the thing to remember is when you create Teams and when you create channels, Microsoft will do things in SharePoint as part of its structure for that. So Teams kind of defines the top of that structure. So it really makes sense to start with Teams from that perspective. And are you creating standard shared private channels is an important part of that discussion as well, and understanding what happens in SharePoint under the hood from there. Now, it's not about just building this pretty picture of what your IA should be. How do you actually implement that? What does that look like? Maybe you've got a whole bunch of file shares that you still haven't gotten into the cloud. Common scenario that we see with a lot of organizations even today. Maybe you've got Teams sprawl, like Teams got thrown at the organization in COVID. Self-service was open for everybody. You got lots of Teams created, lots that were empty, never used, or were used for a period of time and are now dormant or inactive. How do you clean that out and get that structure into this IA that you're building out from there? And this is a change. How do you communicate that? How do you build a change management plan to say, hey, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is why it's good for you, and this is what we need you to do as part of that. And a big part of that often is, hey, you've got hundreds or thousands of teams. We're doing this exercise with City of Sudbury right now. They've been using Teams for quite a few years. They've got literally thousands of teams, and there's a lot of inactive or never used teams in there. First thing is who owns these? Like, let's figure out what the department they belong to, what person they belong to, and do you need this? Does it belong somewhere else? How does it fit into the IA that we're building as an organization? So building that plan and keeping everybody loop around it is a big part of it. So it starts with information gathering. What do you have today from an organization point of view? How does your organization work? What's your organizational structure? What are your processes? Do you have a current org chart? Shocking, but a lot of companies don't have an up-to-date current org chart. I mean, in the City of Sudbury case, they had one, but they also had a service level chart, which is a different way sort of for citizens to think about the city, because they brought in a new CAO and he had these great ideas. I love them around service delivery and service first, citizen first, but it didn't match with the people in the organization and the departments and structure. We had a lot of debate around how do we build that out and what do we use as a horse from there. You can look at your usage report, see how people are actually using Microsoft 365. You can do inventory. We've got a number of open source tools that I'll be talking about to help you with that process. What's your onboarding, offboarding process? How do you make people a member of these teams that you create? Is that manual? Do you have automation around that? Is there forms and workflows? And just understanding where you're at today and where you're trying to get to. So if I look at our Envision IT org chart, this is our typical Visio org chart of the organization with faces and names on it. A little hard to see, unfortunately, from that point of view, but that's a good place to start. Now, there's better tools than Visio, in my opinion, for doing IA planning. Two that I quite like are Sketchboard and Mind Manager. Mind Manager we've been using for more than 10 years. It's an awesome brainstorming tool, not just for doing IA planning. If you're doing a SWOT analysis or strategic planning, things like that, it's actually a really good tool for that sort of brainstorming, because you can share it up on a screen. You can live be dragging things around and moving things and work with it from there. Sketchboard is a little more freeform. I often use it actually for solution architectures and diagrams like that, but it can be used as an IA tool as well. It's quite cheap, so it's I think $8 a month or something like that. Mind Manager is $180 or $200 a year, so what's that? $15, $20 a month, something like that. So not exorbitantly expensive and awesome tools. So I took our org chart, actually did this one last night just as an exercise to say, hey, let's take our current org chart and let's look at our list of teams and workspaces that we have in our tenant and build out a simplified view of our IA. So we've got our Envision IT company at the top. We've got our different departments, operations, marketing, sales, etc. And then some groups underneath that. Like we've got a management, finance, HR group that we've lumped underneath operations. Does this mean that we've got an operations team? Actually, we do, but we don't necessarily have just channels for these. Some of these have their own team associated with them. We have a management team, but we have a finance private channel, and HR actually lives underneath management as part of our team structure. So there's no right answer from that point of view, but the tool helps a lot in terms of being able to map that out from that point of view. And it hides some of the complexity. Like we just have this clients bucket underneath consulting, but as you saw, there's hundreds of client teams underneath that. So that actually becomes quite complex. And we've got our partners, which aren't sites anymore. They're actually channels underneath our sales team. They're actually underneath a partner team related to that. So, I mean, you can get much more complex with Mind Manager. This is a template that we use, and reach out if you'd like a copy of it if you use MindJet yourself. We've got icons for the different elements in there. I think it was based on what somebody else did, so I can't claim full credit from that point of view. We've done some tweaking. We actually need to add share channel in here. This particular template predates share channels, but it's nice to have icons that indicate the different types of elements that you've got in there. I've got a team, I've got a standard versus private, and we'll add the little, infinity loop share channel icon in there as well, the different SharePoint elements, the Microsoft Forms, Power Apps, other things that you may have as part of your information architecture. So I encourage you, if you're having those sort of brainstorming sessions, get a tool, figure out how you want to present it, and visual works really well. It allows people to absorb pretty quickly what you're talking about and describing, and make decisions to quickly adjust from there. So I can come into Mind Manager here and say, hey, I want to pull something in a different spot, and say, well, our partners are under product. So let's just drag them there. So conversationally, you can be doing those kind of changes very quickly through there. You can also look at your Microsoft 365 usage reports. So how are people using 365? What level of inbound and outbound email do you have? How do you compare that to Teams? Is your organization still predominantly email based? Are you starting to use Teams more? Is it all chat? Are you having channel conversations? That answers interesting questions about where you are today. It's not going to define your information architecture, but it's going to be a big influencer on your change management plan coming out from there. And we have another number of open source tools. One we were literally just finishing this morning. It was sort of a last minute crunch working with Flock and with our team to pull some things together here. So for some time we've had a data harvester. We published an open source version of this up. It was more focused on Azure AD and users and groups, which relates to our Extranet User Manager product. But we've expanded the concept of that harvester, and it's pulling in more broad Microsoft 365 information. So, it's looking at what teams you have in your tenant, what Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites, security groups, little typo on member and guest accounts there, but pull all that together. In fact, I've got a copy of it here. I actually only got to see this view finally up with our production data about 45 minutes before the webinar, but it already showed me some interesting things. Here, let me just full screen it so you can see better. So we've coined this phrase workspaces. It's something that one of our partners, Orchestra, uses a lot, and it makes a lot of sense to say, hey, we've got these different types of workspaces. They could be a Microsoft team, they could be a Microsoft 365 group that doesn't have a team, they could be a team site, they could just be a security group. We consider all of those to be workspaces. So what types of workspaces do we have in our organization? We've got an overwhelming number of security groups. We've got some tidy up that we need to do. And we used to have on-premise Microsoft Dynamics, and it created literally hundreds of groups in our tenant. We should just clear those out because we're moving away from Dynamics anyways. We've got a bunch of Microsoft 365 groups. So these don't have teams associated with it. These are predominantly client sites that we created in pre-Teams point of view. I mean, they're back in 2017, 2018 that we're creating those. And what about teams? We have 181 teams in our tenant. And this is where I like to collapse this. I feel like it's getting a little overwhelming for a company of 24 people. Interestingly, we can see, marketing is our first team that we ever created in 2017, which is where we started. We said, hey, let's do a little test of this new thing called Teams in our marketing group. And it very quickly, we started creating teams for clients. We started creating teams for internal stuff from there, and it really took off in the organization. But maybe we can collapse those client teams down from there. We've got some other weird ones. This storage and SharePoint portal server, that's actually OneDrive sites. We've had OneDrive for so long in our organization, some of them go back in time. So I can actually see, who's using how much OneDrive. Yes, I have 0.5 terabyte in my OneDrive. I probably have a bunch of stuff I should clean out from there. We've got communication sites, we even have Teams channels. And this is not every channel in the organization. These are private or standard or shared channels that have their own SharePoint sites underneath them. So where are we using them? Well, there's a bunch for partners, but we've also got some others like that. Operations Finance was our first private channel that we created back in 2020. So this starts to answer some interesting questions about how we're using Teams today. Our plan is to get this finished before I do my workshop in 2 weeks' time down in Christchurch, and publish that up in GitHub and make it all available for open source. So we'll be sending a follow-up to the webinar a couple days after, but we'll have a second follow-up probably next week sometime of where you can actually get this and how you would run this on your tenant side to get the same sort of information from that point of view. We also have some inventory analysis from a document point of view. So we have different scripts that we can run against file shares versus SharePoint on premises if you still have SharePoint servers in your environment, or against SharePoint online if you're on the online world. I'd actually like to blend that with the previous one I was showing you and pull some of that together into one place. So this is still a work in progress. A bunch of this stuff we've got up on GitHub, kind of need to get that organized, so that'll get organized as well before the workshop from that perspective as well. There's also third-party products, and I'm going to talk about a number of them. I meant to flush this slide out. Apologies, I didn't get a chance to do that. Orchestry is another Canadian product based out in Vancouver. Michael Sarek, I know well through the MVP community, has done an awesome job on that. And they have a lot of workspace discovery as part of their product as well. In fact, they're launching out a new flavor, which is a report only, that gives you a bunch of that reporting as well. But their full tool is really about the full lifecycle management of Teams and Microsoft 365, not just the creation of, but the identification of no longer being used or inactive, and how do you archive or delete that? How do you go full lifecycle? Hey, this project was done 2 years ago. It needs to move into this mode. Maybe we have records retention and we need to retain the documents, but can we archive the conversations and tuck it all away? Orchestry can take care of that for us. And it's got some lifecycle management in here that allows me to do things like look at my workspace insights and understand, which are my active versus inactive. Can I identify certain ones in here and go ahead and archive them? This is our dev tenant that I'm showing in here. So it has a whole bunch of wacky named workspaces from that point of view. But an awesome tool from that perspective, and we're going to talk more about it from that point of view. It can actually become part of the discovery phase as well. In fact, with City of Sudbury, I was mentioning we're doing that IA exercise with them. Part of that project is to implement Orchestry, which we've done, and we're able to use the harvesting from that to help us with the guidance process and the identification of what to do with those existing teams and how to reorganize them. Okay. So, ultimately, you've got to consolidate those findings and put together sort of a guiding vision to say, hey, these are what teams and channels represent in our organization. But coming back to my guest conversation and external, you also need to think about who needs access into your information. So, is there existing security groups that maybe IT manages or HR has some connection to their HRIS that you want to leverage through that? Do you use dynamic groups for group membership? There's a lot of power in what Microsoft provides under the hood from a group membership point of view. And then you really should answer that question around external users. A big part of the Microsoft 365 architecture point of view. Who are those external stakeholders? And are you providing access? And what does that look like? How does that work? Now, we've focused a lot on the document and collaboration side of it, but you also want to think about the company communication side. And this one depends a lot on the size of the organization. For us, we've had both a SharePoint intranet with news on it, and it was before it was called Viva Engage. It was Yammer back in the day. We've had Yammer in our organization. Actually, before we even had Teams, we were using Yammer from that point of view. As Teams came along, we're a company of 24. just using Microsoft Teams for us made a lot of sense. One of our channels is called company updates, and that's the place primarily for me, but for anybody to post news to the company as a whole. We could do that in a Viva Engage community, but we're so small that Teams works really well for that. And likewise, we could have a corporate intranet for that. Teams serves that purpose for us. We still have a home page on the SharePoint side, and that makes sense. But for the most part, Teams is our company communications. But you have to look at your organization. Are we a global enterprise with tens or hundreds of thousands of employees? It's probably a strong argument for you to have Viva Engage to really build that social community, the knowledge discovery, expert discovery, groupthink. Viva Engages are really good at that in big organizations. If you're somewhere in the middle, you're hundreds or a couple thousand of employees, you probably do want a formal SharePoint intranet. It may involve a number of different sites for different geographies, for different lines of business and such from there. So that makes sense. So you've got to figure that out as part of your information architecture as well. How are we doing our company communications? If you go the all in on the Teams, you say, hey, Teams is the way we're going to do this. We're not going to have email distribution lists and company updates through email anymore. It's all going to happen through Teams. I think that's an awesome thing. I would expect to see increased engagement through that. It is going to be streamlined. And comparing Teams to email, one of the big advantages, it builds organizational knowledge. If you have a new employee start today, and for the last 10 years you've been doing email newsletters internally with company updates, they don't see any of that history because it's not in their inbox. Their inbox didn't exist before today. Teams is different. When you join the team, you see all that history. It's all there. So that organizational knowledge factor of Teams is a huge piece of it. It's actually why we used to use Yammer instead of email. Teams kind of superseded that for us. Okay. Migration planning. We want to get into this new, wonderful, easy to understand, well-organized Teams information architecture. How do we get there? Well, the first thing I'd strongly encourage you to think about is the provisioning process. How are new teams being created? You probably want to turn off the self-service. Anybody can just spin up a team, but you still want some sort of process. People can request a team that doesn't involve a service ticket to IT that takes 2 weeks to fulfill, because that's going to frustrate people. So there's a lot of vendors out there. Orchestrate was kind of the market leader. They were the first mover from that point of view, but lots of players in this field. We've worked the most with Orchestrate. I know the principals at most of the organizations. They've done awesome jobs. Bind Tuning in Portugal, Rencor in Germany, Provision Point in Croatia, AppPoint globally. ShareGate, late player. They've only just come into the space in the last 6-12 months or so. They're a strong migration story. We've used them for a very long time. We love them from a migration point of view. They're also doing sort of provisioning and Teams governance as well. And it comes back to, as you build your Teams IA and you figure out what are teams and channels represent, if you can build a template for that to say, hey, when we create a project team, it should look like this, and we're going to use Planner, and it should have a planner associated with it. It should have these folders for the project files. It should have these channels. Build a template of that. And all of these tools will help you then take that template and apply it to that new team so that there'll be a consistent experience. That's a big part back to the beginning. So do check those out and look at that from that point of view. The full life cycle, that's one of the things I love about Orchestrate, is they don't just think about how do we spin teams up, but how do we shut them down as well? How do we manage the full life cycle around that? Full disclosure, we have our own open source solution, which we created back in the SharePoint days and kind of evolved into the Teams. We still use it today. We've got a SharePoint framework web part form that can say, hey, I want a new team. It can have approvals in there as part of it through Power Automate, and then it'll take that template and apply it. It leverages a lot of Microsoft P&P, which is the patterns and practices. It's this big open source project started quite a few years ago, both internally at Microsoft and externally. It's got a ton of great content in there from that point of view. And we've got a number of components that really help us from that point of view. I mean, Orchestrate has the workspace directory in here, which is great. And I can add my own metadata and categorize to say, hey, I just want to see client workspaces or partner workspaces, Orchestra will do that for me. We've kind of done the same thing on our side as well. So if I come into our Envision IT home, don't judge me, this is our internet. It's not awesome from a homepage point of view, but one of the things we do a lot of in here is to say, hey, let's just get over to our client's site, which is really just a jumping off spot. And we've got this A to Z web part that's part of our open source provisioning to say, hey, I want to go to a particular client, jump into their SharePoint site or into their team from there. You know, and if I want to create a net new one, there's a form that allows me to do that. So check those options out, a number of different ones from that point of view. And then we've got to think about document migration. You know, whether that's bringing file shares into 365, bringing old SharePoint servers in, or we've got, pardon my phrase, this mess in Microsoft 365 today. How do we reorganize it? We've got to do a bunch of cleanup and migration around that. If it's all in Microsoft 365 already, you know, to a certain degree, the tooling from Microsoft's gotten better. I can move documents and folders and stuff between different sites through the UI. But you know, I'd really think about tools for that, and ShareGate is kind of our primary one from that point of view of how to do that migration. In particular, if you're moving from file shares, one of the most important piece of metadata about files on file shares is when was it last modified. And if you just drag those folders into SharePoint, they'll all appear created and last modified the moment that you drag them in, which becomes really confusing to figure out, hey, I've got 5 versions of the same file, which happens a lot in file shares. Which is the right one, and they all have the same data. I can't tell the difference. So using a tool like ShareGate lets you bring that in and have that come across. And again, there's quite a lot of other migration vendors out there to look at from that point of view. So I mean, it starts with the inventory and plan that we talked about. We often do a process in Excel to do some migration mapping to say, hey, you know, what are we keeping? What are we archiving? What are we deleting? The stuff that we're keeping, where is it going, and who owns it from a business owner or a department point of view. We like to build that out in Excel and work with the business to do that. Provisioning becomes important. You know, you want to have a standardized template before you migrate stuff in. So let's do that. Let's understand our tools in there. Let's do the actual document migration itself. Do some QA around that. Get the business involved to do user acceptance testing. Launch that out, and it's often a circular. You know, if you've got 20 years of file share history you need to migrate across, chances are you're not going to do it all over one weekend. Sometimes you do, but it's a painful process. So you want to chunk it up into bites and take it from there. So I know I'm running low on time here. Let me just keep skimming ahead here. As I mentioned, ShareGate Desktop is a great tool from the migration point of view. Often you'll get drawn into this. Well, Microsoft has this free migration tool. Can I use that? It's gotten better over the years, but every time we go to use it, we get roadblocked by something, and we end up back in ShareGate. So full disclosure from that point of view. What else we got here? Just some other topics. This is kind of its own deep topic on its own, but something if you're concerned about retention, if you have legal requirements as a public organization or public sector, and yes, we will be sharing the video, absolutely. You know, you're probably going to be using Purview, and that will be an influencing factor on your information architecture as well, of what records retention policies do we need to put in place, and how do they become part of our templates. Also, information protection is a very important topic. Do we have sensitive information that we need to classify? Is there personal health information, personal credit information, you know, things like that you need to apply sensitivity labels in and enforce through data loss protection and such? That can be part of your information architecture as well. Much deeper topic to get into, maybe a future talk from that point of view. We do have some supporting resources. So the open source Teams provisioning, I've got a link in here. We're going to be sharing the deck that'll have the live links in it. The earlier version of that dashboard from users and groups point of view is up on our External User Manager site. We will be getting the inventory scripts and the workspace Power BI that I was showing you up over the next week or two. So we'll send a follow-up with those details. If you're watching this session, maybe even recorded over the next 2 weeks in prep for the workshop that I'm doing at Digital Workplace Conference, thank you for doing the homework and prep. Looking forward to seeing you there. If you're in the New Zealand and Australia, you want to come check out an awesome conference. Debbie Ireland runs a great conference both in New Zealand and Australia. Come check that out. The workshop is on Thursday, Feb 29th, but the Tuesday, Wednesday prior to that is the main breakout sessions of the event itself. We've got a bunch of other events coming up. Going to be kind of continuing my traveling around, doing a webinar in sort of 3 different time zones days on data room topic. Going to be in Germany talking about British people search, which is actually a topic I'm doing at Digital Workplace Conference as part of a breakout session. And then a break from tradition for me, more onto the Power Platform side at the Power Platform Conference in Brussels. So I know we're pretty much out of time here. Julian, was there questions? I caught a few of the chats as they went by, but I'm sure I missed some. Or do we want to take those as takeaways and follow up?
I think you caught most of it, but yeah, there was a question. We'll definitely, as Irina said, we'll be sharing this within about 24 hours just to get it cleaned up and posted, and we'll also include the links. And absolutely, if you have follow-on questions, I know Peter, when you do it live in the workshop, it often gets a lot of questions. So please view this as the start of a dialogue.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your day.